Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to another discussion of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Today, my good friend Dr. A.P. Canavan and I are going to be discussing House of Chains. This is the fourth book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. You can see AP's much nicer edition there over his shoulder. Are you going to show
Philip,
us?
do you honestly think that's the one that I read? I have like paperback copies. I have stuff.
Yeah.
That's the nice one.
I've got this. That's all I've got, folks. But it works. The pages are what's in there is what counts, right? It's what's on the inside that counts, right?
It's what's on the inside.
Yes.
So very good to be here again, Philip. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's always great to talk to you, AP. So very excited.
But look, I dressed up for you because if we're going to do the academic discussion, apparently I need a jacket.
And you are looking very spiffy, and no doubt the jackets will elevate our discussion accordingly. So I'm excited though, because not only are we talking House of Chains today, but in the very near future, I'm going to be talking with AP as well as one of our other Malazan friends, Ruth and Bad, about the Bocaline and Corbel Broach novellas. So I guess there are 7 of them now, but there was 3, and then there were 3 put together, and then there's another one that Steven Erikson has sort of written on his
on Facebook.
On Facebook, yeah, okay.
For free. I mean, you can literally just go back down his page and see the handwritten pages as he was writing it.
That's kind of cool, yeah.
So it's a completely free novella that he just wrote because he was stuck in lockdown. And instead of writing it and sending it to the publisher and all that, he wrote it, went, no, I'll give this for free to the fans, which I thought was actually quite, well, to be honest, I thought it was stupid because he could have made money out of it. But it was, to be perfectly honest, it's what's like Steve just wanted to give people something nice during lockdown. So he wrote a novella for free for everyone.
That's the kind of nice guy he is. So yeah, that's wonderful. But yeah, so we're going to be talking about the first 3, Bocaline and Corbel Broach novellas. And those are, do you remember the titles of those, AP, by any chance?
Blood Follows is the first one, Leaves of Laughter's End is the second one, and The Healthy Dead is the third one. Okay. And you can get them in a collected edition, right, which is the Tales of Bocaline and Corbel Broach Volume 1.
That's what I have. Yep.
Just off the top of my head.
Yeah, very impressive. And later in the month, AP and I also intend to continue with our read of the novels of the Malazan Empire. So later in the month, we'll be doing Return of the Crimson Guard as well. So it's Malazan month here, which is a fantastic thing in my book. So that's all coming up. But today we are talking House of Chains, and this is the non-spoiler discussion of House of Chains. And we will also be having a spoiler discussion of House of Chains, which will appear on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon. And make sure you check out his stuff. It's just fantastic. And you can also see our previous discussions of the first 3 books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, both the non-spoiler, which are on my channel, and the spoiler discussions on AP's channel. So I think
that's because I like spoiling things for people.
Or you're spoiled, or one or the other, I guess, right? But anyway, yeah, this was a one, again, Steven Erikson keeps blowing me away with these books here. And there are some interesting things to note about House of Chains, which there's some differences I hear, I think, from the first 3 books. One of them being the structure. We have a slightly different thing going on here in House of Chains, something we did not see in the first 3 books, which is we have a long arc of development for one character for the first quarter of the book or so. So AP, I would like, if you don't mind, to talk about that first, to just talk about why did Erikson do this? And yeah, anything else of note, because of course you're the narratologist here. So
well, one of the fun things, very briefly as an aside before we talk about this, in narratology, obviously, like a lot of different structural techniques, you strip away all of the detail and you're just looking at structures.
Right.
And because of that, you can do an entire structural analysis of something and never give any spoilers because you're just talking about roles and functions and narrative kernels and satellites. And so I could actually do the entire thing like that, and people would understand absolutely nothing because then you need to have read the book to actually understand what I'm talking about.
Right.
But this is simply to say, I'm going to talk about structure here, and I'm going to do it in a way, it is not going to spoil your reading experience. It's not going to spoil anything. I'm not going to give away any details. But one of the complaints that a lot of readers have is in the first 3 books, we have a lot of different point of view characters, that the story is always negotiated by piecing together these different events and trying to figure out what is happening. And believe it or not, this has been a criticism of the books from the very, very beginning. Yeah. Steve was well aware of it. And Erikson, after hearing this criticism, now at the time, it wasn't phrased in, I'm not enjoying all of the POVs. It was, right. Erikson can't write a single POV.
Oh, yeah?
And Erikson took this as a bit of a challenge because, you know, if you think about the complexity of writing multiple POVs and making sure that they all link and intertwine and move across, that's actually highly complex writing. Right. To do a single point of view is structurally far less complex because it's a single narrative trajectory.
Yes.
So Erikson took this as a bit of a challenge and so incorporated what you can kind of look at almost as a standalone novella. Right. At the very beginning, following a single narrative trajectory. Okay. And I think for a lot of readers of the Malazan series, because you're now so used to multiple character perspectives, this comes as a real shock. You're like, yeah. Oh, we're just following one person or like one narrative story with this one thread.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's actually incredibly refreshing because as with all of these books, each book seems to be challenging a different reader assumption. And it's one of the reasons why I enjoy the book so much, because we see tropes being subverted. We see reader expectation at almost every juncture being subverted. Where you expect Erikson to go ABC, he usually follows up with BR banana S 17 quantum physics. And
you forgot string
when it's laid out like that, it's so much fun, and it I think gives these books a longevity where you can read and reread. It keeps a level of variety.
Yeah.
And you start then spotting these points of connection. So while Erikson may have intended it simply, this is a narrative challenge, a writing challenge, the reward we get as a reader is absolutely phenomenal from this basically first quarter.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful change, different way of approaching it, and in some respects matches the traditional reader expectation for a fantasy novel.
Yeah.
So he subverted his own Malazan fans by giving them something that, you know, if he'd put it in Gardens of the Moon would have been fine, but now it's like, no, but we're used to this now. It's like, no, I'm going to go and do the traditional thing now.
So he subverted his subversion.
Yeah.
That's lovely. And the other thing, though, in addition to for the Malazan books' unusual structure here, is that the chronology of the whole thing. So if you could please just sort of piece all of these puzzle pieces together, because what happens, I believe, in this novella, which would be a novel for most people, it's over 200.
It's a novella for fantasy. It's a full novel for, you know, almost any other genre.
For normal people, it's a novel, yeah. But it chronologically, that takes place before, but we can't say, we're not doing spoilers here, but go ahead.
So if we think Gardens of the Moon, book 1.
Yeah.
And then Memories of Ice, because we could talk about this, book 3.
Right.
Fit together as sort of a narrative continuum where you would expect a sequel to be. So it's almost like a book 1, book 2 of a traditional series.
Right.
But obviously what Erikson did was book 2 was Dead House Gates, introducing the second narrative arena, the second sort of story thread that is going to build in.
Yeah.
So if book 1 is basically that narrative arc is continued in book 3, book 2, where do you think the narrative arc is going to be continued? So that's kind of where we're placing this, that anything that happens in book 4 is really much more tied into book 2.
Yes.
Although, as with all of these books, and when we talked about Dead House Gates, I was saying people don't see it as a sequel, but from a thematic standpoint, from some of the characters moving over, from the events of the world, all of these things, they are absolutely in line with it being a sequel.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people mean by sequel is a continuation of a specific narrative arc.
Right.
And it is understandable. We expect that in a series like Wheel of Time, book 1 is followed by book 2, book 2 is followed by book 3, and it is just going forward in a chronological sequence.
Yes.
But there are plenty of other series that jump around in time.
Yeah.
And when you start getting like these long expanded sequences where suddenly like prequels are folded in and you have long extended analeptic sequences or flashbacks. If they become big enough to be a novel of their own, are they a prequel or should they be read in the chronological sequence? All of this is about the complexity of narrative structures. And there isn't any one narrative structure. It's not like this is the way that you have to do it. Stories are not just, you have to have a protagonist, an antagonist. Right. There are different ways to do it. But this, I think, follows that narrative trajectory of Dead House Gates, but is thematically tied to everything else. Everything flows into one another. They all work together as a sequence.
Yeah, definitely. Nice. And there are a lot of interesting insights. I think we're in a non-spoilery way. We can just mention to our potential readers, people continuing in the series, we're assuming you've read the first 3 books. So,
because if you haven't, I've just ruined stuff for you.
Yeah, not really. No, I don't think so. I don't think you've ruined anything, but I think actually what you said is very helpful, to be honest. If I had been just starting the series and somebody like you had explained all that to me, I would have been, thank you. So anyway, the magic, for example, is something that we get some insights into, right? In House of Chains.
And I think, because if we think Gardens of the Moon set up a lot of mysteries and strangeness, and then in Dead House Gates, little tiny bits were answered, but more mystery and strangeness was added.
Yeah.
In Memories of Ice, we got some development, and now in House of Chains, we're getting that further development. We're seeing it now start to, our minds are wrapping themselves around these different perspectives. Yeah. We're seeing more of it. So those elements that we sort of saw expanded in Memories of Ice,
right,
we actually see developed even further in House of Chains, and we see a lot of the ramifications of things that have been going on in the world, particularly in Memories of Ice.
Right.
And we also get insight into some of the divine machinations.
Yes.
And that is when we see these deities and who have pretty much always been these very far off figures, we start to get better glimpses of them.
Yeah.
And that gives us this additional perspective of there are stories within stories within stories going on.
Yeah. And them behaving very much in the manner of the Greek gods, and getting involved and manipulating.
Those Greek gods, those naughty boys.
Yes. Yeah. Very naughty. So, okay, nice. Another thing that we see in here in the tradition of the Malazan books are some really great pairs, some duos, and just we'll talk about them, of course, specifically when we do the spoiler section, because there are quite a few really good ones, but it's these characters who just bring out the best in each other, and the dialogue between them, some great humor involved in many of these duos as well, wouldn't you say?
Oh, there are some that we will talk about this in the spoiler section, but there's one duo in particular. And Erikson has been very open in interviews about this, so like we're perfectly free to talk about it.
Okay.
But we need to touch on. But what I will say is, again, people who read Gardens of the Moon and went, "Oh, I wanted to follow all of these characters," and we only got a couple of them in Dead House Gates.
Right.
And then we went back to Memories of Ice, and there's a whole load of new characters as well as a bunch we'd already been introduced to.
Yeah.
So think again, House of Chains is filling that same sort of function as Memories of Ice. So yes, there are going to be more new characters.
Yeah.
But there are certain characters coming back that you go, I remember them. So again, you know, people say that Erikson always throws you in at the deep end, and it's always these new places and all these new characters, and I get fed up having to read. He always gives the reader a hand. Like it's not that he just constantly goes, oh yeah, completely new setting, completely new story, completely new characters.
Right.
There's always an olive branch extended to go, yeah, I know it's tough, but here's some people you already know. They're going to go on the journey with you.
Nice. So you're saying that when we talk in the spoiler section, we're going to be more specific about this, but there is a duo in this book that is based on perhaps something from real life. Is that
yes.
Okay, this should be interesting then. Another thing from real life that you see a lot in this book, but also the previous ones, but I feel like it's even more prominent in here, is Erikson's archaeology, right? I mean, there's some great archaeological stuff in here, right?
Oh, it is absolutely fascinating. And you know, we can actually talk about this aspect as it's entirely spoiler free, because we're not mentioning it in context or anything.
Right.
But there are a couple of different moments here. If you recall in Memories of Ice, when Tull makes the arrowheads for Tok.
Yes.
Here we have extensive discussion of flint napping.
Yeah.
And this was something, until I met Erikson, that I knew absolutely nothing about. Flint napping? What the hell is flint napping?
Are you saying you've never done it before?
Well, you know, only on weekends. I dabble, you know. But,
right.
And it was actually Erikson's son also spent some time trying to explain this to me.
He's an archaeologist as well, right?
He's an archaeologist by training as well.
Nice.
Brilliant guy. Really, really nice. But we have all of this sort of discussion of the flint napping. And the weirdest thing is, because Erikson actually knows what he's talking about, it's one of those elements that adds such authenticity to the world. Because this is an entirely fictional secondary world, but some aspects of it are so real that it has this bleed out effect across the more fantastic elements to make them more believable. And it's the way that Erikson weaves in details like that. It just makes this world seem much more alive.
I totally agree. From the details, like working with flint, to the layers of civilization that you get in these books, which we could talk about. I think it's important in the House of Chains as well. That plays a role. The lives, the previous lives, and the sense of connection that we can have with those previous lives, those previous civilizations. That is just something I adore about these books, and it gives them depth, real depth.
Yeah, probably about 6 fathoms at one point.
Yeah.
But one of the things, actually, no, this is a weird thing, not a spoiler in any way. A big academic concern at the minute that's being debated in a lot of academic circles is the Anthropocene, the human impact on climate, the human impact on the world, the fact that we are living in this time period that is being shaped by humanity.
Right.
Here we have a book where this concept of the Anthropocene is one of the major aspects of it. And it's, if you think, this is now a concern of academics now in 2021.
Right.
Philip, have a quick look there and see when Erikson wrote this.
Yeah, well, it was...
No, open your book and give people the date.
Okay, it was copyright 2002. 20 years ago, almost, yeah. And he was writing it probably earlier than that. Wow. Huh. Very interesting. And it's not a new phenomenon. He would know it as an archaeologist. He would be very aware, but human beings have stripped landscapes before. If you look at your corner of the world, for example, probably it was once forested or something, you know?
Allegedly. None of us have any knowledge of that.
Yeah, because your way back ancestors chopped all the trees down, right? So.
But I mean, it's a fascinating aspect of it. So anyone interested in the environmental storytelling and all of that sort of stuff. There are huge elements of that that are woven into the world.
Yeah.
That I honestly think in today's climate, not to use a really bad pun, but in today's climate where we're focused on this is something that actually, when you read the book, entirely secondary to the story and everything else that's going on,
yeah.
that this is another aspect that makes these works so interesting. And then you can link that back to some of the aspects in Deadhouse Gates and some of the things explored in Memories of Ice.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, there's some big issues in here, in addition to the human impact on the world around us. There are some horrible things that happen in the course of all the books, but I think House of Chains, I mean, there's some difficult things that we will mention, obviously, when we do the spoilers in more detail, but there are...
Well, this is something that, to be perfectly honest, I don't think this is a spoiler. It is not a spoiler because you're not going to go any. I think it is perfectly reasonable and fair to warn people in advance that there is sexual assault and rape in this novel.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say, in context, that it is perfectly appropriate for this inclusion because of how it is dealt with, what happens to the characters, and why it is there.
Right.
But I wouldn't want any reader going into this novel and then going, I didn't know this was there, and actually being horrendously upset.
Right.
Bad stuff happens in the Malazan world. Bad stuff happens in A Song of Ice and Fire. Bad stuff happens in The Wheel of Time. Bad stuff happens in epic fantasy.
That's right.
Horrendously bad stuff happens in The Sword of Truth. But one of the things that I think is a strength of Erikson's writing is how he depicts it, how he deals with it,
right,
and the sensitivity with which these aspects are dealt with.
Exactly.
There are very difficult topics addressed in it. And this is no different from any other work of literature that attempts to assess and explore the human condition. And that includes the good and the bad.
Absolutely.
So I think it is absolutely fair to warn people in advance. There are a couple of distressing scenes, a couple of scenes that may really upset you. And you know what? If you get upset at them, that is absolutely fine. People getting upset at them is the point. We're meant to recognize that these things are bad.
Right.
If you aren't getting upset at these depictions, you have to worry about A, how it's been depicted, or B, why you're having that response.
Right. Right.
But again, a lot of that is how the author is dealing with things and trying to elicit certain responses in the reader, that these things are included deliberately. So I think it's perfectly fair to warn people. And I think it adds significant value to these novels that Erikson does not shy away from difficult issues. He doesn't sweep them under the carpet and ignore them.
Right.
He forces us as readers to challenge our assumptions, to read these things and actually engage with them instead of pretending they don't exist.
Yep. And he does it with some very flawed characters who reflect the world that we're in. And the fact that, according to characters, this applies both to the real world and the fictional world we're talking about here, but there are characters who live within cultures where a certain way of acting is the right way to act. This is something I teach when I teach Beowulf, for example. You know, it was good to go out and get vengeance, right? That's a virtue, right? To commit more violence as a response to violence. That was considered the appropriate thing to do. And from our perspective, well, hopefully we have a more nuanced view of that. But there are characters who live within cultures where certain acts are seen as praiseworthy, which we would not. And then you get into the issue of moral relativism, I think. And this is something that I have sensed in the past while reading these books. I made the video about morality in the Malazan world. And I don't think that Steven Erikson based on my reading of the books, is advocating any kind of moral relativism at all in these books. I don't know what your take is, AP, but
well, I think it's very, very clear that Erikson's perspective on moral relativism is that it is a bad notion.
Okay.
But he has written a fantastic essay on this, okay, which was on his Facebook. Because it involves the name of a character, I'll mention that in the spoiler version.
Video, yeah.
But he addresses this specifically because there are aspects when you're part of a community, a part of a culture, part of a society, you have, and that's what you're surrounded by. Right. You believe this is normal. Right. We live in a world now where we have multiple communities all over the place trying to interact. And if we had the assumption that, well, my way of thinking is the only way of thinking because everyone in my community thinks that way, this is the right thing to do. How do you think the person in a different community is going to think? They're going to have exactly the same thoughts about their community values.
Right.
And if those values are different, who's right? What Erikson, I think, explores in this is that you have to be cognizant of different cultural values.
Yes.
But there are some things that are still, no, this is wrong.
Right.
No, this is right. There are some things that we can definitively say, no, this is where the line is.
Right.
But depending on where you stand, that line is either in front of you, or that line is behind you. And that's one of the issues that as readers, we have to negotiate because, this isn't our world. This isn't our time period. Characters from a culture that is not our own are doing things that we personally disagree with.
Right.
And you go, yeah, we find that abhorrent. What if I was raised in that society? Would I still find it abhorrent?
Yeah.
And I think we like to lie to ourselves that we would go, yes, I would still find it abhorrent. And you go, really? If we're being honest with ourselves, if everyone we grew up with, our family, our friends, our extended family, everyone in the village, and we didn't have the internet, we didn't connect to all of these things, we lived in an insular community.
Right.
Are we honestly saying that, oh yes, I would be able to take a step back from my cultural practices to go, no, this is wrong.
Right.
And it's an amazingly challenging thing to confront in yourself.
Yep.
To realize, yes, we all have implicit bias because we are shaped by how we grew up, what our culture is, what our background is, what our experiences are. Yeah. Are we well traveled? Have we spent a lot of time, talking to people from other cultures?
Right.
What about other ethnic groups? What about other religions? What about other sexualities? What about other genders? All of these things figure into our understanding of the world.
Right.
And when you have a fantasy world portrayed in front of you saying, well, okay, here's this culture.
Right.
And we have to negotiate that. That is the challenge. And again, it can be very challenging for people. It can be difficult. It can be uncomfortable.
Right.
But dealing with it, engaging with it, is you look at it and go, I never thought of it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, one of the major things that Erikson works into the whole series. Yeah. Asking the reader, showing the reader, here's this thing. Now try and think about it from a different perspective.
Yes.
He never says, you must do this. You must read it this way. This is what this means.
Right.
He doesn't dictate to the reader. His whole style of writing that we keep talking about is show, don't tell.
Exactly.
And it allows a reader then, you're the one in charge of interpreting this.
Right.
And that is tremendous trust and faith that the author is putting in his audience, because Erikson never talks down to us. Right. Erikson never dictates to us. He's laid it all out there, and he goes, I know that you'll be able to read this.
Yeah.
And then it's up to us as whether or not we think he succeeded, whether he failed, whether it worked for us, whether it didn't. But we are being trusted, we're being engaged, we're being asked to participate in this experience. And it's absolutely, it's one of the great strengths of the series.
I absolutely agree. It's interesting because we keep coming back to this notion, this theme, the overarching theme of empathy and compassion. But it's never Erikson saying, be compassionate, be compassionate. That's not what it is. So when we talk about this theme, that's not what's going on. What he's doing is he's presenting situations in which sometimes characters are not compassionate, but they have the opportunity to be. Sometimes characters are compassionate when they don't necessarily need to be. And there's a big mix in here, but it also, I think, evokes something in the reader. In those moments when the characters do connect, something I find rather beautiful, which is a sense of compassion. It's really something. I mean, he does that very well. If he just sort of preached at us, be compassionate, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. And that's not at all what this is.
And if it was written under very strict ideological lines, right. Goodkin's sort of truth is very much like this. Goodkin wrote with a very specific philosophy, right. And he was enunciating it on the page. And so Goodkin's work has to be read in that light, because right. Otherwise, if you don't kind of follow that and agree with it, it becomes a very difficult read, because there's no flexibility to it. It has to be this way.
Kind of fossilizes it, doesn't it? Then, I mean,
well, fossilize it. You could say that, but I would argue that that's a slightly pejorative term. Yeah. But let's just say some people really like that level of clarity. Mm-hmm. And this is a personal preference about narrative, about storytelling, about films and TV and books and whatever it is, that how we're consuming this. Sometimes we really like clarity. We like a story told to us.
Right.
And it's like, that Sunday afternoon when you're lying there and you're tired because you've been out on Saturday night, you're like, oh, just put on something mindless that I can just follow along and I know what all the beats are. And it's comforting. You go, right. Does that make it a bad film? Of course not. It's right. A good film for that reason.
Right.
Do you want to watch a really complex, mind-blowing, weird David Lynch kind of movie that's asking you all of these things when you're really tired on a Sunday afternoon after being like, that sounds hellish. That is like the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
But there are times when I want to be engaged. I want complexity. So it's not that simple, straightforward, and being told is bad.
Right.
It's these are different types of stories. And if we try to read Malazan as if it is a straightforward, this is what the author is telling us, and this is the story.
Yeah.
This is why so many of us have frustrations at certain points, because we keep trying to force the narrative.
Yeah.
And we don't know where it's going. And one of the reasons why rereads work so well is because you know where it is going. You're not trying to force it in that direction. You're not trying to figure things out. You go, I know where this is going. Now I can actually engage with the entire depth of this world.
Right.
With all of these questions. And if you think of the great books of literature, the canon of English literature, the books that you can read and reread and reread again and again, and each time get more depth, more complexity, more interesting notions, that when you read them at different points in your life, they suddenly have completely different meanings. These are great works of literature. The books that you read once and go, oh yeah, that was entertaining. That is not a bad book. It served its purpose and function for you. It entertained you. It engaged us. It did the thing that it was meant to do.
Yeah.
But it's trying to do a different thing than what this series is doing.
Which I think it's a masterpiece. It is a masterpiece in that sense. It is a classic. It will be a classic, I hope. Should be. Yeah.
Well, and people should trust you because you have a PhD.
Exactly, right? I keep telling my kids that, but they don't believe me. So. All right. Well, I think we covered the most of what we wanted to say in the non-spoiler way. I certainly enjoyed myself. I hope our viewers will do the same. So I think anything else, AP, for the good of the order before we move on to our spoiler discussion?
Only to say thank you once again, Philip. It really is a pleasure to come on and talk to you about these books. I know we're going to have a spoiler chat, but not everyone is going to come across for the spoiler chat. Absolutely fine. So I want them to know it really is a pleasure chatting to you about these books, enjoying these books, and trying to show people, without ruining any of the different aspects, why two academics are so engaged about what so many academics sneer at, fantasy literature. Yeah. And here we are, two doctors of literature going, but these books are brilliant.
Yeah, they are. They are brilliant.
So thank you so much, Philip, for this opportunity.
And the pleasure is most certainly mutual. It's always an honor to have you here, AP. So I'm
particularly when I wear a jacket.
Particularly, I think that that definitely helps. So, all right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. And for those of you who are going to come over to the spoiler video, it'll be out in probably a day or two after this one, and we will see you there. For the rest of you, thanks for stopping by.